Hi guys, this is just a quick little bonus video that I thought might be useful for helping you guys learn the topic 3.2, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Hopefully if you're watching this video, you've already seen the lecture video or you've looked through the concept guide, so you kind of get an idea of what this crazy snowflake graph is supposed to mean. But if you haven't quite yet, just as an introduction, this crazy aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph basically helps us predict both economic growth in a macro economy and also predict our business cycles. So I thought it'd be really interesting if I could show, using the model that we're learning in class, what is happening in the economy right now in response to coronavirus. So you've probably heard by now that we're in a recession or something like that, or that this is going to cause a recession. So as a little bit of a reminder, that language recession refers to the business cycle in the US economy. The idea that if we look at real GDP or real output over time, that an economy kind of does this. It has this long-term trend, but then there's these peaks called expansions and these dips called contractions. And if a dip is really bad, we will call it a recession or a depression. So we are going into one of these dips in GDP because of the coronavirus outbreak. And so our little model here essentially can predict that. So what I have here on the other slide is the concept guide for topic 3.2. And so we're going to go through and we're going to look at the list of the different events that can shift aggregate demand and aggregate supply and see what's happening based on what we know is occurring in the economy. So if I were to use this model to predict what is happening in the US economy in response to coronavirus, I would say two things. First is that aggregate demand is decreasing. And I also think short-run aggregate supply is decreasing. I'll tell you why. So we're going to start with aggregate demand. So as a reminder, aggregate demand has four components: C for consumption, I for investment, G for government spending, and NX for net exports. So there are shifts in aggregate demand from this concept guide that can shift any of the components and therefore shift the aggregate demand curve. So for consumer confidence, changes in consumption, I think it's safe to say that a lot of people are worried about losing their jobs. We don't know how long people are going to be unemployed. And so a lot of consumer confidence, I think, is down. Nobody's looking to invest in new big durable goods purchases like a brand new car or a new house or a new laptop. And the reason why is because we are not confident about our income situations. I'm not. I'm sure you're not. People in the hospitality industry certainly aren't. So for aggregate demand, consumption spending is definitely down. Okay. If I look at investment, that's business purchases. Business and investor confidence is definitely at an all-time low. If anybody follows the stock market, things like that. Nobody's really looking to start a business in these times because everybody has orders to stay at home and not go out to new businesses. So I think it's safe to say investment is down for the US economy. And then the last thing I'm pretty confident about are changes in foreign incomes. So we have a lot of countries who are our trading partners who have been hit by coronavirus, even worse than the United States in terms of the death toll. And they are in recessions as well. And so that means there's going to be less demand for all things, including US goods. So our index is down. So the first thing that I'm pretty confident with, at least based on what I know is going on, is that we have a big decrease, a shift to the left in our aggregate demand curve. Look at that. So this is probably aggregate demand with coronavirus. All right. Now, if this was a normal aggregate demand, aggregate supply question, we would just mark this new equilibrium right here. And as a result, this change would mean that we have lower prices than where we started, lower GDP, higher unemployment. We do see lower GDP and high unemployment, record high unemployment right now as a result of this, but prices are actually fairly stable right now. So that's why I think, in addition to aggregate demand shifting to the left based on what we know is happening in the economy, short-run aggregate supply is also shifting to the left. The way I justify that is because many states and many cities and local and federal governments are issuing those stay-home orders, shelter-in-place orders. They are making all non-essential businesses close down. So essentially what these government officials have done is they have told the producers or the suppliers in our economy, hey, until this thing dies down, we need to minimize contact with others. So I'm going to pass a law saying you have to not do as much business anymore, whether that means closing restaurants, closing hotels, shutting down gyms, all of those places where people gather. There's kind of this law in place that's saying shift this guy to the left as well. Now, when I put those two changes together, this is my short run aggregate supply curve with coronavirus. Now we kind of see what is happening in the economy, which is that we've got this lower level of GDP compared to where we started. Our economy is not as productive. We've got very high unemployment, right? Even higher than this point that I had marked before, right? But prices are staying pretty much where they were right before, right? We don't have hyperinflation or deflation going on just yet. Remains to be seen how prices will respond over the longer term. But this is pretty accurate reflection of our situation right now. And we essentially predicted our recession, right? GDP is below our potential. Unemployment is high. There are record-breaking numbers of people filing for unemployment since the recession of 2008. This is what I think is happening in the economy. So the question of what will happen long-term pretty much depends on the virus. If we leave this on its own, we know that short-run curves generally circle back to where they started, and that with aggregate demand, will wind up at the same level of GDP as short-run aggregate supply will increase back out eventually and will come back here long-term. But whether or not that happens is subject to change. We don't know what's going to happen long-term. So I'm going to move over to this graph. So there's one potential outcome, is that we could return to normal eventually. However, it's also possible long-term that we could shift this long-run aggregate supply curve. So as a reminder, going back to this concept guide, this long-run aggregate supply curve basically shifts when there are permanent changes to our resources, technology, and institutions, the same characteristics that determine economic growth. So depending on the results on our population in response to coronavirus, we could deal with a lot of deaths. We could lose a significant portion of our population, like other countries have. And not to be blunt about it, but one of the resources, when we permanently change our resources, has to do with labor. Labor is one of our 4 resources: land, labor, and capital. And if we lose a significant amount of the U.S. population, whether it be just older folks, whether it be healthcare workers that are at higher risk, we are going to permanently decrease our long-run potential. Our long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left if a lot of people die, right? So this could be our new potential GDP. We could have permanently lower GDP. When the long run shifts to the left, short run shifts with it. There we go. This will be SRAS2. And so we could long-term, if a bunch of people were to pass away from this disease, see some inflation, see some lower GDP, and essentially our economy would just decrease in terms of potential long-term because of all the destruction the virus caused. So this is also a long-term potential outcome that we just don't know yet, because we don't know if we're going to flatten the curve, things like that. So hopefully that gives you a little insight into what's going on here with coronavirus. I'm going to post a follow-up video that's going to show what the government is doing to basically counteract what's going on in this model. That's tied more to the last topic of the semester, 3.4, monetary and fiscal policy. So if you're wondering why the government is writing everyone checks for $1,200, it's actually based on this model as well, and ties back in through all the concepts we'll describe throughout the semester. So I hope this helps at least understand where we're at right now and why the economy and the government is responding as they are. And yeah, so we are definitely living through an interesting part in history. This economic data will definitely make its way into economic textbooks of the future. So interesting stuff. Email me if you have questions about this concept, the recession, coronavirus. Well, I'm not an expert in that, but as far as it relates to the economy, I'll try my best. See you guys later.